In the east, the Old One lives in Ironwood, and there she bears Fenrir's brethren, the wolves. From this race shall come one that shall be mightiest of all, he that is named Managarm, the Moonhound. He shall be gorged on the blood of all those men that die, and he shall swallow the moon, and sprinkle with blood the heavens. All the earth trembles, and the mountains shall fall to ruin. All fetters and bonds shall be broken and rent. Then shall Fenris Wolf be loosed. The sea shall gush forth upon the land as the Midgard serpent stirs in violent wrath and advances up onto the land. Fenris Wolf shall advance with gaping mouth, his lower jaw scraping the earth, the upper touching the heavens. Fires blaze from his eyes and nostrils. Hello again. I'm back with part 2 of my series on the children of Loki and Angrboda. And in this episode, I want to talk all about the second of Loki's sons with the giantess Angrboda, Fenrir, or the Fenris Wolf. So in these earlier passages from the Prose Edda, we learn that Angrboda had many children, many troll children, or Jotun children, not just with Loki. It here names Hati, Skull, and this Managarm, or Moonhound, as other wolf sons of the witch who dwells in Yarnvid, or the Ironwood, who is Angrboda. And these are not attributed to Loki specifically, but they are named as Fenrir's brethren. However, Fenrir is the one that we perhaps know the most about from the Prose Edda, because it's here that we get the entire story of the Binding of Fenrir. And this is where we also get probably the most info from the myths and Eddas on the god Tyr as well, because he features a very important role, or as a key figure, in the Binding of Fenrir. And I think depending on which gods people personally choose to venerate, it can definitely kind of skew modern day pagans' opinions on this tale and what its further meanings are. So let's get into that and examine not only the stories, but the many different interpretations thereof. Now, in Gylfaginning, as we discussed in my last video, it has a quick passage on the children of Loki and Angrboda, wherein it says that they had 3 children, Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel. Jormungandr, as we previously discussed, was thrown into the sea and cast away by Odin straight away and became the world-encircling Midgard serpent, and Hel he cast down into Niflheim, which later basically became her realm of Helheim, and he put her in charge down there. But what about Fenrir? So we know that this was another child born in the shape of a wolf, and later in Gylfaginning he goes on to state that the Aesir raised the wolf at home, aka in Asgard, but only Tyr had the courage to approach and feed him. But when the gods saw how much he grew every day, and when all prophecies declare that he was fated to be their destruction, the Aesir knew that they had to devise an escape. The Aesir decide that they are going to try to devise some type of chain, rope, or fetter with which they can bind Fenrir, tie him up, and lock him away where he can't do any of them any harm. Because as we all know, nothing bad ever happens to anyone who tries to escape their fate. And so the Aesir themselves crafted the first fetter, named Lading, and brought it to Fenrir, inviting him to test his strength against it. And so much like in Thor's fishing trip, here we again have kind of a test of strength, or a feat of strength, here being requested by the wolf Fenrir. And the gods are kind of trying to talk him into participating in these tests by saying, well, you know, if you really want to prove yourself among us and prove your worthiness, prove your strength, and win yourself honor and glory and renown, then you will do these things. Because if you're able to prove that you're strong enough and break all of these bonds that we're trying to put upon you, then you will be mighty and glorious indeed. And so they kind of talk Fenrir into it. He says, like, that sounds pretty good. I wouldn't mind some of that acclaim. And so he let them put the first chain upon him. But the first time he stretched his muscles, the fetter broke, and Fenrir freed himself from the first test, lading. Next, the gods went back and made a second fetter, twice as strong as the first, and this they called Dromi. Again, they asked Fenrir to test himself against it, saying that he would be even more renowned for his strength if it was unable to hold him. And so he thought that even though this fetter was very strong, his strength had grown even more since he had broken the first one. And he also recognized that if he was going to become renowned and famous, that it would require him to put himself into some dangerous situations, so he let them put the fetter on him. When they were ready, the wolf started to twist and beat the fetter against the ground. He struggled with all his might, and using his legs, snapped the fetter with such force that the pieces flew into the distance. Thus he escaped from Dromi. After this, the gods began to fear that they would never succeed in binding the wolf. And so they kind of determined here, in a fun little metaphor or play on words, that if nothing can hold the wolf, then they must therefore go to the dwarves or the Svartalfs or Black Elves and have them make a binding out of nothing. And that is just what the dwarves do. They use all of these materials that don't actually really exist or are kind of oxymorons in a way in order to craft this magical binding. And it's said that it is constructed from 6 elements. The noise of a cat's footsteps, which cats are known to be very silent when they walk, and so they don't really have the sound of a footstep. And it's also made from the beard of a woman, which typically women do not have beards. The roots of a mountain, which a mountain is made of stone, it's not a tree, and so can't really be said to have roots like that. The sinews of a bear, and the breath of a fish, which fish live under the water and don't have breath, and the spittle, which I think is also another term that I've seen used for venom of a snake. And so whether it means venom or spittle or spit, it's again not really something that we see being produced by birds very often. And so they are able to craft this magical binding out of all these kind of mystical, mysterious ingredients that don't really exist in nature. And therefore, if nothing can bind Fenrir, then they use nothing to create his bindings. So an interesting little metaphorical loophole there. And again, interesting to note that when the gods kind of exceed their own means, that oftentimes they are forced to go to the dwarves or elves to create magical objects which they themselves lack the power to construct. So thus did the dwarves create the fetter called Gleipnir. And it is described as being smooth and soft as a silk ribbon, yet reliable and strong. Then the gods traveled out onto a lake called Amsvartnir, the pitch black, and sent for the wolf to accompany them. They went onto an island there named Lingvi, where they showed the wolf the silky band, offering to let him try to break it. They told him that despite its apparent thinness, it was stronger than it appeared. And Fenrir, after studying it, answered that it seemed to me that a ribbon like this one, which is so narrow a band, offers no renown, even if I were to break it. But if it is made with cunning and treachery, even though it looks unimpressive, then I will not permit it to be put upon my leg. So Fenrir is kind of starting to suspect that something is up. He says, this looks like just a silky ribbon. Why would you even want me to test myself against that? It doesn't look like anything which could hold me. But since you're really insisting that it's even stronger than the first two that you tried, methinks some trickery is afoot. But the Aesir say that if you are able to break free of this bond, then we know that we will have no reason to fear you, and we will free you. So this is a little bit perplexing on its face. If he's able to break out of this strongest bond yet, somehow that's proof that they can trust him, and they'll set him free. It seems to me like if he was able to break out of this magical binding that they would have even more of a reason to fear him. But perhaps they're saying like, well, even if you were to get really out of hand later, the fact that we know we'll be able to use this to bind you should we need to, and we kind of have this as a backup plan, means that maybe, we don't have to worry about it and you can just go be about your business. But Fenrir is still not very persuaded, and he says that if you were to bind me in such a way that I was unable to free myself, then you would betray and abandon me, and it would be a long time before I received any help from you. Therefore I am unwilling to allow the band to be put on me. Rather than questioning my courage, why not let one of you place his hand in my mouth, as a pledge that there is no treachery in this offer? The gods now looked at one another, realizing the seriousness of the problem they faced. They know, deep down, that this binding will work. They know that it will indeed go exactly as Fenrir says, and the binding will be able to hold him, and they will just leave him tied up there. And so, as kind of a show of trust, he asks that one of them place their hand into the lion's mouth, into the wolf's mouth, literally, before he will agree to be tested. Yeah, if you really have nothing to fear from me, and you're not trying to trick me, I'm not trying to trick you, then neither of us have anything to worry about, right? Right, guys? Right? They know that this is going to work. They are going to bind Fenrir, and that by putting their hand into his mouth, it's pretty much guaranteed that in order for this plan to work and be carried out, and in order for Fenrir to be bound, as they need him to be bound for their safety, that it's guaranteed one of them is going to lose a limb. No one was willing to hold out his hand until Tyr raised his right hand and laid it in the wolf's mouth. But when the wolf strained against the fetter, the band only hardened, and the more he struggled, the stronger the band became. The gods all laughed at this, except for Tyr. He lost his hand. So Tyr here, I think, this is where he gains his association with sacrifice and justice in a way, because he is willing to make that self-sacrifice and be the one to put his hand into the wolf's mouth, knowing full well what it means. And not only that, but we'll get into some of the personal UPG implications thereof later. But when the Aesir saw that the wolf was truly bound, they took the part that hung loose from the fetter. It was called Gelgia, and they threaded one end of it through a huge stone called Gjöll. They fastened that stone deep down in the earth. Then they took an enormous rock called Viti and drove it even further down into the earth, using it as an anchor post. As the wolf struggled, he opened his mouth. He gaped horribly, trying to bite them, but they slipped a sword into his mouth. The hilt stuck in his lower gums, and the blade in the upper gums, wedging his jaw open. As he growled menacingly, saliva drooled from his mouth, forming the river called Van, which means hope. There he remains until Ragnarok. And here Gangleri asks, why didn't the Aesir just kill the wolf, since they knew they could expect only destruction from him? But High One answered, the gods hold their sacred places and sanctuaries in such respect that they chose not to defile them with the wolf's blood, even though prophecies foretold that he would be the death of Odin. So in terms of modern day interpretations, I feel like people can go one of two ways with this story of the Binding of Fenrir. Some who really worship and revere Tyr as a god of oaths, justice, fortitude, sacrifice, will say that the god's actions here were necessary. They were just. They knew through prophecy that Fenrir was going to lead to their doom, and so they had no choice but to do what they did, and to tie him up. But they really kind of had to do this through means of trickery and treachery. They had to trick Fenrir into going along with this, because they knew that there was no way they were going to get him to be bound up safely otherwise. And so I think this also, in my opinion, and here we're just kind of going straight into my own personal opinions and UPGs, so do not come for me, but I think it also speaks to that noble sacrifice on Tyr's part, or self-sacrifice, not only because is he the only one who was willing to put his hand into the wolf's mouth, knowing that they were misleading him, and knowing that therefore he was going to lose his hand in order for them to get away with this. But I think if you are willing to extend that a little bit further, and maybe it's reading too much into it or reading between the lines, but it does kind of just come down to people's own personal opinions, experiences, perspectives, and UPGs. But in a way, it almost makes me wonder, since Fenrir was raised and brought up in Asgard, unlike the other two of Loki's children, if perhaps he was able to form more of a bond with the Aesir as a result. Not all of them, but Tyr in particular, because it says here that Tyr was the only one who would approach him and was the one that fed him. And it makes me wonder if perhaps they had a deeper relationship, or just more of a relationship than is alluded to in the text. And in Germanic society and Scandinavian society in particular, we know that the fostering relationship, or the relationship of fosterling or ward and foster uncle or foster father, is a very deep, sacred bond. And it makes me wonder if such a bond may have even existed between these two figures, to the point where in the back of my mind, I wonder if Tyr, going into this test of strength, testing all of these bindings against Fenrir, and trying to trick him into going along with this, and trick him into testing his strength against Gleipnir, knowing that it was a trick, and knowing that the gods were being a little bit dishonest here in trying to trick him into putting it on, if maybe perhaps that didn't sit right with Tyr. He's a god of justice, oaths, honesty, and maybe whether, the ends justify the means or not, if it was necessary or not, perhaps just this part of it, having to use deception to go about this, maybe it shouldn't sit very well or sit right with Tyr. And maybe that was a factor in why he was the one who agreed to sacrifice his hand, because he knew that in order to kind of make up for this trickiness and this deception, it was, kind of literally going to come back to bite them, or that the price was going to have to be paid. And speaking of things coming back to bite you, this was something that I kind of wanted to bring up in my Jormungandr video, but didn't get around to. But these two stories in particular, of Odin casting Jormungandr aside, casting him away, literally making him an outcast from society, but then the serpent growing so large that he comes back around to bite his own tail, and will be the one that leads to Thor's downfall later. But with this Binding of Fenrir, and the Aesir putting it down to prophecy, and, well, we just know that Fenrir is going to be bad and lead to nothing but destruction, and so we have no choice. For the greater good, he has to be locked up and bound away and tricked, and really kind of treated very horribly. It's not a very nice fate that he has to look forward to until Ragnarok. And so, to me, it kind of feeds into why I sometimes call Odin the god of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because throughout all of these sagas and these myths and stories, he is constantly trying to avoid his fate and avoid this doom of the gods that is fated to befall them all at Ragnarok. And it starts with Voluspa and Baldur's dreams, where Baldur is having dreams of dying and dreams of Ragnarok. And so Odin knows about Ragnarok, he knows what's waiting for them, and he's just doing all of these things, these very ends justify the means things, to forestall this fate. And it kind of becomes very Greek tragedy, because, as we know from some of those stories, there's only so much you can do to avoid your fate, and in a lot of cases, the more you do to try to avoid it, the more it just leads to this self-fulfilling prophecy. So, to me, it just makes me wonder how much of this could have been avoided. And it just leads into this very paradoxical, cyclical way of thinking of which came first, the chicken or the egg, If Odin hadn't cast Jormungandr aside, if he hadn't just decided that this fate was sealed and Fenrir equals bad news and must be locked away. Because up until that point, even with the first two tests of the first two bindings, he was pretty game for it. He was pretty willing to go along with it. It seemed like he just kind of wanted to prove himself to the Aesir and prove that he was worthy and safe to be among them. He wanted to get renown for himself and win himself some glory and kind of a place among them. And so he was willing to be a participant in whatever they needed and wanted of him. And so it just kind of makes me, maybe I just have a soft spot for Loki and his children, and in particular when you listen to the Neil Gaiman version of the story, he does kind of a good job of making Fenrir a little bit more of this sympathetic character, where he just wants to be a goodest boy and prove himself to the Aesir and prove that he is no harm to them, or just prove that, he just wants to live among them and he'll do whatever it takes to prove that he's safe and doesn't mean them any harm. And this is what he gets for it, when really he hadn't done anything up until this point to show that he was a danger. At least from what we see of the stories, it just says that they raised him, he was getting really big, and they were scared of him. But he didn't really do anything to make them be afraid. And so, it just makes me wonder, if they hadn't betrayed him in this way and tricked him and bound him in this way, would he have still grown to harbor a grudge against them to the point where he is Odin's fated destroyer at Ragnarok? So, did the things that Odin did here in this story and that the Aesir did here in this story lead to the very fate they were trying to avoid? It just leaves you with a little bit of food for thought there, in my humble opinion. Maybe, maybe it was unavoidable. Maybe even if they hadn't taken this action, something would have happened later something different would have happened to turn Fenrir against them. But it just makes me wonder if they hadn't bound Fenrir, would he have been turned against them, or would he have remained an ally, perhaps? And if Odin hadn't cast Jormungandr away into the sea, would he have grown so big that he literally comes back around to bite them in the butt later? When it comes to Fenrir, I will just kind of leave you with that food for thought to gnaw on and wrestle with. But I think that there is perhaps a lot of different takes, a lot of different opinions to be taken away from the story of the Binding of Fenrir. And was it necessary? What does it mean? I'll just leave this video there and look forward to the third and final part, where we will be discussing not only the little that we have from the stories on Hel, but also my own personal experiences and UPGs with her. So until next time, stay classy, pagan.